Okay. All right, and I will obviously share that with you. All right, looks like we're recording. Let me share my screen. First slide. All right. Can folks see the screen? Okay. Yes. Excuse me. All right. There we go. Try to move this around. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's start my stopwatch here. I really appreciate the attendance today. My name is Lisa Barrero, and I am, if you might have heard me say a couple minutes ago, I'm in the Department of Interprofessional Health and Aging Studies. I teach in the Doctor of Health Science program and the Master of Gerontology, or now it's Master of Aging Studies programs. And one of the courses that I teach, along with my colleague Laura Centuri, is qualitative research. And my areas of research, which focus on the experiences of older women, is always from a qualitative perspective. I knew when I started my doctoral degree that that was my thing. It aligned with my values, how I see the world. So that's my point of view and my area of expertise. I'm a faculty fellow, and qualitative research is one of my designated areas for that. So those of you who are faculty or staff, if you feel like you'd like to consult with me or ask questions at a later time, set up a time to talk about a study you're thinking about, maybe want to talk through design or have me look over something, I'm happy to do that. That's kind of what I do in my fellow role. So feel free to reach out after the fact and we can chat. So I am open for those conversations. So today, because the session is geared toward those who may not have a lot of experience with or exposure to qualitative research, the approach for the session is really going over fundamentals, the tenets of qualitative research, and then the latter part will be more of a kind of a practical approach. How do you conceptualize, maybe starting to think about a research project, thinking about research topic, research question, looking at methodology and methods. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. And as I said, I practice this, and I think I can get it all into the time. I want to have some time at the end for questions, so I'll be watching the time. So if it seems like I'm kind of plowing through, I am, just to make sure I get it all out there. But hopefully I'll articulate it and not be going too quickly. But first, I'll talk about the tenets of qualitative research, namely the purpose and the assumptions that underlie this approach. And I like thinking of the research as learning to see. This comes from one of my favorite books, Qualitative Research by Carrie Daly, Qualitative Methods for Family Studies and Human Development. It was one of the first books that I purchased for a qualitative course I took in my doctoral program, and it's been my favorite ever since. Although there are plenty that have been very helpful to me, but I like this one. I like the way it's laid out. And one of the things that he talks about is learning to see, that qualitative research really, the aim is to understand the world from your participants' perspective. It's not just measuring a phenomenon, looking at outcomes, looking at cause and effect, but learning to see through the experiences of others. So when we talk about assumptions of qualitative research, the first thing to think about is the idea that qualitative research really stems from a way to look at life, a way to look at human experience. It really stems out of philosophy in many cases. A lot of the approaches to qualitative research come from certain paradigms, certain assumptions about how to look at the world and how we experience it as human beings. So the subjective experience is really at the heart of that. So looking at the complexities of human experience, the fact that what we experience in life is so much more than what we can measure. It's not black and white. So qualitative research is really deep and layered, and has a whole lot of meaning to be explored, and that's the approach that's taken. So those assumptions that are inherent in qualitative research stem from that. And some of the other things that are acknowledged in qualitative research, one is that what we do, how we think, how we approach life is completely contextual. It is shaped by where we are in space and time, our environment, the people we're around, our social interactions. All of that influences what we do and how we perceive things. Our realities are emergent. They're always being shaped. They're being constructed by the things that we experience and what we engage in. We all interpret our realities differently. If we're all in the same room experiencing the same event, we all have different interpretations of that. We experience it differently. We'll remember it differently. And as such, our realities are continually being redefined by our later experiences. So all of this is acknowledged within the qualitative approach to research and our understanding of the human experience. Another really important thing to keep in mind is the bottom bullet there, that the role of the researcher is acknowledged in qualitative research. It's understood that as researchers, we approach projects as human beings who ourselves have experiences, assumptions, perceptions that we bring to the table and overlay, across our taking in of the data as shared with us by participants, as we analyze the data. All of that is part of the research process, and qualitative researchers acknowledge that, and it's part of how we understand the research process versus quantitative research, where the goal there is to separate researcher as much as possible. And in qualitative, we know that is impossible. So that is an acknowledged part of the process. So given that, some of the purposes of qualitative research, it's got an inductive focus. So rather than taking a hypothesis that we might develop based on existing research and testing it, through our research, we're searching for explanations in the data, or perhaps building theory. So that's, generally speaking, the way that qualitative research is situated and the way it's approached. And in most cases, individual experiences of participants are described. This varies a little bit depending on the methodology, but in general, we're looking at unique experiences of participants, and then also patterns or common features as well. And then the aim within that is to communicate really a rich description, an in-depth account of what the participants are going through, how they perceive things, what their experiences are like from their perspective, through their eyes, not just, an account of what happened, they did this at this time. It's how did they perceive that? And then explores that contextual piece, the relationships in their social world, looks at the history of their experience with that phenomenon, keeps in mind cultural factors, environmental factors, geography, anything that could influence the way that participants experience something is taken into account. And then most often uses open-ended approaches to data collection, interviews, focus groups, observation, and oftentimes in a naturalistic setting to make sure that all of the data kind of flowers forth in an organic way as possible, so that you're really getting a genuine view of the participants' realities. And then the aim is not to generalize to populations. And I know that, when I read some qualitative studies, once in a while, I'll see an author list the inability to generalize as a limitation. For me, I don't agree with that because the aim to generalize, the generalization was never an aim to begin with, so therefore it can't be a limitation. So as I'll state a little later in the presentation, we do have sort of a sister term for generalization called transferability when it comes to ensuring rigor and trustworthiness in the qualitative process. We think about transferability such that, could our findings be similarly found in a group of people living in a similar context with similar characteristics? Could we see, similar perceptions, similar assumptions, similar experiences? But it is not the same thing as trying to generalize the data and replicate it in larger or other populations. So generalization is really not a thing in qualitative research in its purest form. So given all of that, in general, topics that align well with qualitative methods, there are lots. I wanted to give you a few examples of general topics that can go well with this approach. So looking at the environmental context when it comes to institutional change. So for example, how the process of instituting, let's say, new practices or a new system or approach to doing things in a particular organization was impacted by the culture of the organization, something else to do with the environment. Investigating complex social processes. I'm thinking maybe the dynamics between parents and teachers of young children during the pandemic. Looking at those social dynamics, it's a real complex process. Looking at meanings and perceptions associated with common experiences. So how do we make sense of, how does a person make meaning of, let's say, engaging with the healthcare industry, engaging with the healthcare industry during COVID? What did it mean to pursue health or self-care during the pandemic? And then other feelings and attitudes and beliefs about certain behaviors. I know in health, we look a lot at health behaviors. Why is it that some people choose not to pursue or engage in healthy behaviors and choose instead to pursue unhealthy behaviors? So there's a whole lot of theory behind that. But we want to look at, why that is. What are the attitudes and beliefs about those health behaviors? Maybe someone, in health belief model is a common health theory. Maybe there are particular perceived barriers to accomplishing that health behavior. So investigating those feelings and attitudes behind particular behaviors can be another great general topic to look at with qualitative methods. And of course, every discipline can lend itself well to this approach. So I want to move from the tenets to methodology. How can we conceive of qualitative approaches? How do we frame what we want to do? And we do that through methodology. So, you start off with a topic and a research question, but then you need to frame it. So first, let me go through some of these to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. The first thing to clear up is the term methodology itself. Oftentimes, I see the terms methodology and method used interchangeably, but in qualitative research, those are really two different things. Methodology, which there are various methodologies, phenomenology, grounded theory, narrative, which I'll go over in a minute, but methodology serves to link some of those scientific assumptions and assumptions about the world, theory, and then forms of inquiry together to form approaches to carrying out research. It's shaped by some of the inherent concepts within those approaches, because those approaches draw from philosophy, historical approaches to inquiry, anthropology, phenomenology, philosophical phenomenology. So all of these things work together to form these discrete approaches to research that we call methodology. And also the use of these methodologies serve a political and procedural role. So what I mean by a political role is, in many ways, in some circles, qualitative research is sort of the ugly stepchild to quantitative research. Quantitative research is sometimes upheld as like the gold standard of research because, you've got these randomized controlled trials, thousands of participants, lots of data, lots of numbers to measure these patterns, to tell you what's going on. Yeah, and that's helpful. It serves a very important role. However, there are limitations. Getting at the how and the why of a particular phenomenon, what it means to experience something. For that, you have to dig more deeply. And for qualitative researchers, sometimes it's like fighting for legitimacy. So this is the political piece. So having a methodology to follow that has a certain standards and certain steps and approaches and rules helps to hold up that legitimacy. And in the same way, it holds up, it establishes a procedural role. So it can help the decision-making process toward, well, what am I going to do in this qualitative research? What steps am I going to take? It helps to frame that. And as you'll see as I go through these different approaches, that there's some overlap between these methodological approaches. Certainly, there are things that distinguish them all from one another, but there is a lot of overlap because there's so much that's foundational to qualitative research that's inherent in all of them. And then in contrast to methodology, method describes the tools or techniques used to carry out the research. So what are the actual methods, the procedures? Is it going to be interviews, focus groups, data review, observation? And so the methodology helps to guide the choice of methods. So research question, topic, methodology, method. So to frame the different methodological approaches that I'll describe, I want to give you a topic example that I can carry through. So the topic example I thought of is depression among older women living in an assisted living facility. So not a research question, but just a general topic. So if we were to pursue this from a quantitative perspective, we would focus on what's quantifiable. We might look at a cause and effect relationship, something that's very directional. So maybe factors that increase risk for depression. What are those? How do we measure them? What are some of the health effects of depression? And what are more pronounced than others? What are some depression outcomes over time and how do we get there? Whereas a qualitative focus would look at the participant's experience, use that lens, sort of an inward look at how the women living in the assisted facility experienced certain things. So for example, you might look generally at how they experience depression. What is their day-to-day lived experience having depression? You might look at the meaning of seeking mental health services. You might find that there's a certain stigma. You might find that they think they are seeking mental health services by talking to their pastor or talking with their family. You might look at their assumptions about mental health care. So there's sort of the distinction between qualitative and quantitative. And again, I'll carry this example through as I talk about the common methodological approaches. So the first is phenomenology. Again, this is one of the approaches, it's very common and it draws from an actual philosophy, phenomenology, that focuses a lot on consciousness, aspects of our consciousness, how we make sense of our world and how it plays out in our minds. It focuses on the lived experiences. So the day-to-day realities, the day-to-day lived experiences of individuals regarding the phenomenon of interest. It involves what we call bracketing. So if you think back to what I talked about before, that there's an acknowledgement of the role of the researcher, that their experiences and assumptions are part of this process. It's kind of stirred in there. Well, bracketing is a specific phenomenological way to acknowledge that, but also to set those assumptions aside. So even though as qualitative researchers, we acknowledge that who we are plays a role, we also acknowledge that sometimes you've got to kind of set that to the side so that you can focus on the participants and really understand the world through their eyes and not your own eyes, or as little as to focus as little on your own eyes as possible. So bracketing is a way to do that, and they call it bracketing your reality. The way to bracket your reality can be through journaling. We call it a reflexive journal or reflective journal. You can memo, which is also a way to take notes about how some themes might be emerging from the data, and you kind of take note of that. Write it down, and also write down your thoughts about how those are taking shape. And that's an inherently reflexive process, because you are laying down your assumptions about how it's playing out, in addition to how you see things going in the research process. And that, in effect, allows you to kind of take stock of the role that you're playing in research, but then kind of set it to the side so that you can focus. That's bracketing. And then, because in phenomenology, you're looking for that depth, you're looking at that lived experience. Oftentimes, researchers will engage in multiple interviews with the same participants. So that is something that's unique to phenomenology, or can be unique to phenomenology. And then with this approach, there are a lot of different types, so a lot of different flavors of phenomenology. But it's pretty agreed upon that there are two main categories of phenomenology, specifically descriptive and interpretive. But even within those, I mean, Creswell, the textbook that we often use in our courses, talks about a whole lot of other approaches. So transcendental phenomenology is one. There are probably 5, 6, 7 approaches to phenomenology, and I don't know the intricacies of many of those, but descriptive or interpretive are the ones that are focused on the most, at least from what I've seen in the literature. And interpretive is much more focused on cultural context. Descriptive is just that, where you're really searching for ways to describe the participant's experience through their own eyes, whereas interpretive, you're trying to interpret the realities in a way that honors the way that the participants interpret their own realities. So you can really get in the weeds with phenomenology, believe me, there's so much writing on it. But really, if you're studying phenomenology and seeking to do a research study, my advice is to pick an author that focuses on phenomenology and stick with that interpretation and run with that in terms of the methods and the analysis. Because if you don't, and you start to take in all of the different types, it's really too much, and you'll get confused. It's confusing. But these are the main tenets, but just know that there are different ways in which to conceptualize phenomenology and approach it, but there is, common themes among them all. So a phenomenological approach to our main example here of depression among older adult women in assisted living facilities. So again, you would do interviews to explore their subjective experiences and perhaps to determine the meaning of seeking mental health services. You would engage in that bracketing, the memo writing, or perhaps the journaling throughout that process. You might do your first set of interviews, code those interviews for particular words and phrases that pop out, come to some initial conclusions about those first interviews, and bring that back to the participant to engage in further data collection in your second and perhaps third interviews. Another methodological approach that's common is grounded theory. And just like the name says, the goal is to generate theory to explain a phenomenon. It is intentionally systematic. It's perhaps a little more systematic than other approaches. Originally, when it was developed by Glaser and Strauss, it had a more positivist approach whereby they were sort of assumed to be this external reality that we can discover, right? But in qualitative research, that's really not at all the way we assume reality to be. Reality is constructed and different for each person. So after Glaser and Strauss, founded this approach, there have been a whole lot of other authors that have branched off from that and created their own camps, so to speak. I say 4 schools because those are the main ones that people talk about. But eventually, Glaser and Strauss kind of parted ways, and they both had their own approaches. But now you've got Kathy Charmaz, who I was very lucky to attend a workshop led by her. I was like, fangirling because I'm such a fan of hers. But she has what's called she developed what's called constructivist grounded theory. So she kind of brought it back to the main tenets of qualitative research and looked at how we construct our realities. Okay, grounded theorists use something called constant comparative analysis. So taking the data and constantly, continuously coding, comparing codes, looking at the development of themes along the way for theoretical sampling and theoretical saturation. And what I mean by that is, as you see themes start to emerge from the data, and that's a really important term too, emerging from the data, grounded theorists will follow those themes, follow up on those in subsequent interviews in order to develop that theory, to construct that theory. And at the same time, they will continue to sample in order to follow up on that theory. So that's kind of how the theory development progresses in time, is they kind of grab onto the things that are coming to light and explore those in a deeper way through participants along the way. And they pretty much never say how many people they want to be involved in their study, to be in their sample, because they're going to go until their data is saturated. They're going to keep on going until there are no more new things that emerge. So that's called theoretical saturation, where they have saturated that theory, they've heard all there is to hear about that, and they've got their explanation that they can form into their own theory or explanation about that phenomenon. So in terms of our example with depression, the grounded theorist will interview residents and then conduct data analysis, that constant comparative method, and then repeat that again and again and continue to sample to flesh out that theory so that they come to that solid understanding of what's going on to explain that phenomenon. And then all along the way, they'll memo write, take notes on their thoughts about how that theory or those themes are developing, and be reflexive about that. Another one I want to focus on here is ethnography. This is another one that's rooted in something. In this case, it's anthropology. So you hear a lot about anthropologists doing field work. And it is indeed an in-depth study of culture. You're kind of going out into the field and looking at a cultural system and immersing yourself in that system. It's an inside perspective, EMIC. So looking at how the phenomenon works within the system and kind of getting in there and trying to immerse yourself to feel it, to experience it over time. That immersion can last for a long time, 12 to 18 months. So if someone says they've done an ethnography, if I read a paper and they say they've done an ethnography and they've interviewed over a course of 3 weeks or a month, I think, I don't think so. As historically, ethnography is extended period of time within a cultural system. And then it's holistic in the sense that we acknowledge that people live within these systems. It's kind of like the ecological approach that we talk about a lot in health or public health, which is that the person, it's kind of like an onion. You've got the person, their community, their family, social structures. All of those things play a role in how we engage in life. No person is an island. So we acknowledge that in ethnography and try to jump in there and be part of it for an extended period of time to truly understand it. So how we would approach that among older adult women living with depression in assisted living facilities. So again, immerse ourselves in perhaps a particular one facility for a year or so, maybe a little more, and deeming that as the cultural system. Again, a length of time, devoting yourself to those months. And in ethnography, observation is a big part of it. So there's participant observation and non-participant observation. Non-participant being where you're kind of a fly on the wall as much as possible and you're observing what's going on over here. And participant observation is where you are, as a researcher, part of the thing. So you're part of the activities happening, you're inserting yourself into that. And I would imagine in this example, you'd probably be a non-participant watching what's going on. And then there are typically interviews or some kind of interaction in that way, conversations going on. Case study, that's a term I think we're all familiar with. We use case study a lot when we teach educational methods, health, to start a dialogue about some concepts that we're learning. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're focusing on the research approach of case study. We're talking about bounded units, which is a phenomenon that is can't be separated from its context. So that's bounded together. So a bounded unit can be an institution, let's say one hospital, or a hospital system could be a case. Individuals within that system could be individual cases. And case study, as is true with qualitative research in general, we're not trying to generalize to a particular population, but we might be generalizing to a particular theory of how something works. And in this case, or in this approach, it's common to use mixed methods. So looking at multiple methods to investigate the case, to illuminate the characteristics of the case. So you might do interviews, you might do focus groups, you might conduct a survey and observation, document review. There are a lot of ways to get at that, especially when you're looking at, let's say, a hospital system. There's a lot of data to collect to really understand the inner workings based on your research question. And in this way, it can be useful in program evaluation when you're really wanting to understand how a particular program affects its participants, maybe how it is run with the coordinators, how the administration plays a role. There are a lot of ways to get at that. So as such, in our example, the task here would be to identify what's the bounded unit. Maybe it's a particular assisted living facility. Maybe they have a family of facilities you want to look at, or you might want to look at particular residents as cases within that system. And then do that thorough exploration. You might interview some of the women, you might interview some of the care providers, some of the administrators, you might conduct surveys about their experiences or document reviews. So there are a lot of different ways to engage in data collection for case study. Narrative, and this is sort of a fun one. It's a storytelling approach. You're really looking at the in-depth experiences in a little bit of a different way. It's highly contextual. It's very rooted in place and time. The stories that are bound to the moment in which you talk about them, because stories change over time. The idea is, as I say here on the third bullet, stories serve a social purpose. So why is it that these stories are important? So to understand why narrative will be the right choice for you, I think that the choice is sort of obvious. When people choose narrative, it's pretty much the only choice because the story is so important. So one example that I've given before is stories of individuals who are perhaps fleeing a war-ravaged country, maybe seeking asylum. What is that experience like? It's probably not enough to do an hour-long interview about that. I mean, this is a life-changing experience of folks who are trying to save their own lives and settle in a new country, and everything that is involved in that experience deserves a narrative approach, or can be perceived as deserving a narrative approach. So storytelling in that case is an appropriate approach. Another way to engage in narrative is a narrative analysis called discourse analysis, where you're looking at actual discourse between individuals. So you're looking at pauses and turn taking, talking over each other and those sorts of things, engaging in an analysis of how that plays out and what that says about relationships and social contexts and perhaps power differential. So an example for our depression scenario, you might look at stories of particular women and their experiences with depression. And then, you might be looking also at a discourse between residents and providers, but in this case, I would think that stories of particular women might be the most appropriate. And And then finally, a basic interpretive. This is interesting because up until, honestly, I started working at UIndy, I hadn't heard of this. I had heard of it, but I hadn't heard of it because I'm sure that any of you who have read a qualitative study that in which the author didn't name one of these approaches, they probably did basic interpretive. So honestly, up until I worked here, I thought, you know, there's this thing that students want to engage in, but maybe they don't want to do a pure phenomenological or grounded theory study or whatever, you know, and I had trouble articulating what to call that. Well, Miriam is an author who has talked a lot about this basic interpretive approach, which is just that. It's a generalist approach to qualitative research when perhaps the researcher doesn't necessarily want to delve into a fully phenomenological study or grounded theory or narrative or ethnography, but wants to get to the how and the why of something, and wants to perhaps borrow some of the tenets from the other approaches. And honestly, it's pretty common. I wouldn't say it's the most common, but it's a pretty common approach. So if you're reading an article in which none of those other approaches are mentioned, it's probably basic interpretive. It's one that's used a lot in education. I've seen it in studies that are in a clinical setting where practitioners, maybe they've seen a phenomenon happening or they have some quantitative data to explain something, but they want to understand more about it. Well, I wonder why that's the case. So yeah, basic interpretive. Okay, so I'm at 35 minutes here. Let me talk a little bit about data collection and analysis in qualitative researchers. And I would imagine that some of you, all of you have heard of some of these things. But common methods, of course, in qualitative research, I've sort of mentioned these along the way in this last few minutes: observation, interviews, focus groups where you've got 5 to 8 or so individuals who you are interviewing at the same time. Sometimes you have document review, maybe looking at public documents on a topic. Maybe it's about a health concern, or maybe you're looking at medical records or an individual's private documentation that they're giving you access to. You might look at other audiovisual materials, such as you know, photographs that someone's provided you, videos, maybe art objects, other cultural artifacts. And then there are other visual methods, such as photo elicitation and photo voice. I'd love to get into that. I don't have time for that, but it's a wonderful way to dig deeper into a phenomenon, the visual methods. Sample size, of course, in qualitative research is typically small. And, you know, even as a qualitative researcher, I think a lot of us are always learning. I know Dr. Laura Santuri, who I work with a lot, she and I talk a lot about this because we co-teach qualitative methods, and we talk about things all the time that we are trying to teach our students in different ways to conceptualize it, to convey it to them. I think when you are trying to teach something, you're also a learner, or you have to learn it even better because you're trying to convey it to others. So sample size is one of those things that can vex qualitative researchers. Well, how do I decide how many participants that my study needs? Well, one article that Laura and I have found that's been really helpful is an article that talks about information power, which essentially what it boils down to is looking at how many participants do you need to really dig deeply into the topic and to give you enough information where you feel like you've got enough power to speak to that. And it's informed by a variety of things about how specific your population of choice is, or your inclusion criteria, how in-depth the interviews are, how much data you get from your interviews. There are a whole lot of different factors that go into this, but information power is even if you don't use that term, really the spirit of it is at play in qualitative research, because the point is to get enough depth. You can have 3 participants in a qualitative study as long as you have enough depth and information to give you what you need to truly answer that research question. But it is typically small. Now, in grounded theory studies, you typically need more participants to develop that theory to reach theoretical saturation. I've always been told 20 to 30 participants. I don't think that's a magic number, but definitely more in grounded theory. And there are several strategies to employ trustworthiness or increased rigor, and I'll talk about that here in a second. And so qualitative approaches to analyzing the data that you collect from those methods are characterized by these things: immersion in the data. So once you have, let's say, transcripts from interviews or focus groups, reading those transcripts multiple times to really almost get into the head of your participants. There's a process of coding and theme development where you're examining the transcripts to pull out key words and phrases that really speak to that research question, and then developing themes to speak to those patterns. Oftentimes, you'll use more than one researcher to increase credibility in the analysis of the data. So to make sure it's not just your interpretation and your lens that is going to tell the stories of these individuals. And you can also employ the use of computer-assisted qualitative data analysis like NVivo, Deduce, Atlas TI. And then here, I've created this fun chart just to show you this inductive process of an approach to data analysis. So that immersion in the data, letting the data speak for itself by really reading and rereading those transcripts when you've got that as part of your data, learning to see, looking for those words and phrases that stand out and assigning codes to those, and then organizing those codes into a spreadsheet, into a code book. So you've got them all laid out there. You have a description of each code, the places in the transcript where those codes exist. So this is part of the rigor here. Then you'll distill those codes down to categories. So if you're looking at what does family mean to these participants, well, they may have a whole lot of different codes that have to do with family, and that may be one of your categories. Family means safety. Safety might be the category that might be made up of 15 or 20 codes that have to do with safety. And then finally, you're going to reduce those categories down to just bigger overarching themes across participants, and then begin your theory development if applicable. And remember, this right here is a general characterization of qualitative data analysis. It mostly goes about like this. But again, depending on the methodology, this may look a little bit different depending. And a quick note about trustworthiness. In the interest of time, I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but again, because of that kind of ugly stepchild kind of idea of, we're not worthy, compared to quantitative, qualitative researchers really try to boost the credibility of the research by employing methods that make it rock solid. And there are a lot of ways to do this, but the 4 pillars of trustworthiness, at least according to GUBA, are credibility, transferability, confirmability, and dependability. All 4 of those have sister terms, I call them, to quantitative. And I could go on about my issue with likening it to quantitative, because I think that it's still like, trying to align yourself with quantitative research, when really I don't think that we should be concerned with that. But yet, I think it does help to frame some of these things by inserting a quantitative equivalent. So with credibility, the equivalent term is internal validity. So making sure that the themes and the interpretations that we put out there actually reflect the participants' reality in a genuine way. Transferability, that's kind of like generalizability, where we're looking at, well, if we were to do the same study with a similar group, similar characteristics in a similar environment, would we get kind of the same sort of perceptions? And that's our hope. Confirmability is kind of like objectivity, but again, we know we can't be objective, but yet we acknowledge that it's helpful to set aside our assumptions in order to focus on the participants' experiences. And then finally, dependability, which is akin to reliability. So making sure that others that come after us could carry our study in the same way. So in order to do that, you need to be clear about your methods, have an audit trail, which is here in the green list, making sure that you are explicit about every step of the process so that someone could replicate that study and do the same thing if they've got a similar group of people that they want to explore the phenomenon with. Triangulation, so using different methods to get at the phenomenon. So if you're looking at something very complex like identity, you're probably not going to get to the heart of someone's identity through one interview. You know, you might do some photo elicitation, you might have them do some journaling, you might do several interviews. You know, there are a lot of different ways to kind of get at, to kind of hone in on, to triangulate that complex phenomenon. Member checking is a way in which to go back to your participants and check in with them to make sure that the interpretations you've drawn from their stories are accurate. The last thing you want is to publish a study and have them read it and go, wait a second, that's not reflective of what I went through. So doing that member checking is another way to increase, especially credibility, so that your interpretations are accurate. And then that prolonged engagement, which is really more reflective of ethnography or studies in which you've got maybe, you know, a few months under your belt to really get a sense of the phenomenon rather than just the one hour interview. That can help as well. And then peer review, getting your colleagues who have some expertise in the topic or in qualitative research to audit some of your transcripts. You might also have a researcher be a second coder to code the transcripts independent of you. And then you come back together and compare your codes to make sure that it's not just your own assumptions that are leading the way. And then finally, in these last few minutes, I want to talk about conceptualizing a qualitative study. So key considerations, if you're thinking about, boy, I'd like to start a study, I'm not really sure how to do that. Developing a research topic that aligns with the tenets of qualitative research is important. You know, I've had folks talk to me about maybe a qualitative study they want to do, and I remember thinking or saying to them, you know, it sounds a little more quantitative, like you really want to understand the cause and effect. I don't know if what you really want to understand is really a qualitative consideration. And then articulating a solid research question. Once you've got your topic, develop a question that targets what you want to know. So if I have a student who's really struggling to develop a research question, and let's be honest, it's not really easy to write a great research question off the bat. There's a lot of revision that has to go on. But oftentimes I'll ask, what is it that you really want to understand? Just tell me, don't write it in a perfect way. Just talk to me and say, what is it that you really want to know? What's missing from the literature that you really want to know? And oftentimes when they say that, then I'll be like, well, there's the heart of your research question. And then it's down to wordsmithing and getting to a point where you can really lay out a nicely constructed research question to reflect what they want to know. And it needs to be feasible to answer. You can't, you know, understand the perspectives of all, you know, individuals experiencing depression all across the country through a qualitative study, not feasible. And then choosing a methodological approach that aligns well with the question. So given your question, is phenomenology the best fit? Is a basic interpretive approach the best fit? Maybe grounded theory. So making those choices is key. And again, as I mentioned before, the research topic drives the research question. And then that question, what you want to know, will drive your methodological approach. So it's not about saying, hey, I want to do a phenomenological study. Let's think about what we want to do. Certainly people have done that in the past, but it's not the best approach to developing a solid research study. And then finally, using that methodological approach to choose your method. So you're going to do grounded theory. Okay, great. Well, how are you going to carry that out then? So in terms of developing a research topic, what topic are you interested in digging deeply into? Those of you who are faculty probably have, you know, a research agenda. So you have, you know, your areas of passion, areas of interest. Well, what within those are you interested in really digging into the how and the why? And then once you have an idea about that, and maybe concurrently with that, what's already known about the topic? Because you might be interested in a thing, but then come to find out, oh, that's already been explored. We already know about that thing. So what's missing from the literature? What's been explored? And it may be a situation where a particular topic might have already been explored in the research, but maybe not from a qualitative perspective. Maybe what's novel about your approach is that you're doing it using a qualitative approach and not a quantitative approach. So looking at what's missing, how your study will fill that gap in a novel way. What does the research need? What do we need to understand? And in doing so, really digging into the literature. As you develop your topic, you don't have to do this fully fleshed out lit review, but you do have to get that sense of what's missing. So determining the best, the most fruitful direction for qualitative exploration will require that poking around in the literature. And you may find that, like I said before, what you're interested in knowing doesn't actually call for a qualitative exploration. Maybe you're really looking more at quantitative, and that's okay. But really, it's talking through things, thinking through things in your own mind, talking about it with a colleague to really get at that. But starting organically with your interests is always a good start. In terms of developing a qualitative research question, as I mentioned, it's not as easy as it seems. The studies that I've done, I've gone round and round with how to wordsmith a qualitative research question. And sometimes I hang on one particular word. Like, do I really want to look at perceptions? Is that what I really want? Is it meaning? It's worth taking a lot of time for this to really pin it down and polish it. It's critical, as I've implied before, to develop a good qualitative research question to inform your methodology and methods. Broad questions, of course, are characteristic of qualitative research to explore a single phenomenon. You don't want to muddy the waters by looking at a variety of phenomena. So looking at a single phenomenon will help you to focus in. And you're not looking at testing a hypothesis, as we've talked about before. And there's often a central question and sometimes some sub-questions underneath that, where you're looking at maybe parts of that larger central question, and kind of to signal that these pieces are really important to me to find out. And using exploratory language. So when we teach our qualitative course, we make students articulate their research questions as a question. So starting with how, or what, or in what way. Other researchers, and this is fine too, they'll state their question more as the study purpose or aim. So the purpose of the study is to characterize, to describe this or that, to understand, to explore, and that's okay. But using that exploratory language is part of the qualitative research question. So again, starting with that how or what, or that verbiage that I mentioned to convey that it's a qualitative design. It articulates a clear and central phenomenon. So what is it that you're really looking at that has to be clear in that question? Avoiding non-directional language, staying neutral. You don't want to use the words like effect or impact, or positive or successful, because you're exploring a phenomenon from the participants' experiences. Once you add a word like successful, the implication is, oh, well, that thing was successful. You're kind of taking the focus away from the other side. So leaving it open is important. And then being sure to identify the sample and, if applicable, the setting within that research question, and then being focused and explicit. So let me give you some examples of a solid research question. A lot of these are from our previous students and their dissertations or doctoral projects. Gotta move this so I can read. Okay, what is the meaning of regular participation in multiple types of vigorous exercise among people with Parkinson's disease who participate in Rock Steady Boxing? So this is a study that I did with Stephanie Miller. So what is that what or how? The meaning of regular participation in multiple types of exercise, that's the phenomenon we're looking at. And then the people in the setting, people with Parkinson's disease who participate in Rock Steady Boxing. Those are the people we're focusing on. How do patients perceive and experience recovery during immediate post-surgical and early strengthening phases of shoulder arthroplasty? This was one of our students. And clearly, the subject, the participants, are patients who've received this procedure. And what we're looking at is their perceptions and experiences in recovery right after and during this particular strengthening phase after their procedure. another student of ours, how do ultra runners approach prevention and management strategies for running related injuries? So we're looking at ultra runners, and the phenomenon we're interested in is approaching prevention and management strategies for injury. What is the meaning? Again, one's focusing on meanings, probably a phenomenological study of pre and post-retirement identity among women who've recently retired from a professional career. This was based on my dissertation, actually. So the phenomenon being the meaning of identity among women who've retired from a professional career. So not just retired women. I was focusing on those who were professionals. And then the last two are a couple of examples where the focus or the research question is worded as an aim. So to characterize how underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities come to pursue a career in the field of occupational therapy. So this is more of a grounded theory, or could be more of a grounded theory approach. So you're developing a theory to explain how this population comes to pursue a career in this field. And then finally, to understand interpersonal and systems level factors relevant to delivering healthcare to emergency department patients who are homeless. So just some examples of solid questions, and then finally critiquing a question. So this is a common a question that the wording is pretty common for new students, new to qualitative research, I guess. To understand the knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, and barriers regarding breastfeeding among women. I get what they want to know, but there's too much going on in terms of the phenomenon, knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, and barriers. You can't, it's too much to look at in one study and in one question. There's too much going on. And then breastfeeding among women, that's a really broad population. What women? And how would you determine what is known and what's not known in the literature? So really honing in on a particular population would be helpful. So here is the a way to revise the question to be in keeping with some of those principles I discussed. To characterize attitudes about breastfeeding among new mothers with minimal social support. So you're looking at attitudes about breastfeeding as a phenomenon among who? Among mothers who have minimal social support. Because research shows that one of the risks or in groups that have trouble sticking with sustained breastfeeding are those that have minimal social and family support. And then finally, we've got just about 5 more minutes left. In terms of methodology and methods, making intentional choices is really key here. I'm kind of repeating some of the things I said before, but being intentional about your methodological approach that draws logically from the spirit of your question. And what's important here, again, as I've mentioned before about choosing an author, doing your homework about the methodologies and making the best choice among what's out there. So for example, with grounded theory, our method or phenomenology, we've got a variety of authors who have very clear ideas and opinions for how to go about those research approaches. Pick one and stick with it, because otherwise, you're having to cobble together a bunch of different ways of doing things, and you don't have a real clear through line as to your rationale for why you're doing things. So do your homework on what's out there. Keep in mind those philosophical underpinnings. What makes the most sense to you based on your question and based what's already been done. And as I said, identify an author and stick with them. And then after you've done that, choose some methods that logically align with that methodological approach. Again, if you're someone who has time and your schedule has a job that permits it, doing an ethnography out in the world, spending several hours a day for several months in the field, you know what method you're going to employ. A lot of observation, a lot of interviews, because those are the things that align with ethnography. So making those choices intentionally is key. All right, well, I made it under an hour, and I'm so sorry that I didn't have a solid 10 minutes at the end for questions. We've got a couple of minutes. Are there some quick questions I can answer? And by the way, do not fear, if you really do have some things you want to explore based on what I shared today, you are welcome. We can have a phone call, we can do Zoom. we can schedule time to meet. That is completely fine. But right now, how do I make this get bigger? How do we do this? Oh my gosh. Well, regardless, I'm gonna, gosh, you guys, I'm having a moment. How do I, oh, okay, there I am, okay. Is there anyone who has a question? I'm sorry, I had a Zoom moment. I haven't shared for a while.
What software, if I might ask a question, what software do you recommend to help with your coding?
Sure. The software that I would recommend, simply because it's the one that I've had the most exposure to and have had colleagues use most often who swear by it, is Deduce. I have access through UIndy. I know that they don't have unlimited, there's not unlimited access among faculty at UIndy, but you can certainly look into that. But regardless, Deduce comparatively, as I understand it, is more cost effective. You pay by the month. You're not locked into a contract. I think it's like 14 or 15 bucks a month. And you pay as you use it. And I think according to how many people are in it, I'm not sure, but the price point is pretty low compared to NVivo. It's also pretty intuitive to use. I've seen the data sets or the qualitative data that's been put in there by Dr. Laura Santuri. She swears by it. She's done a lot of coding within it. You can create a code book within Deduce. Store your files. There are a lot of great bells and whistles within Deduce that are intuitive to figure out. So I would recommend starting with Deduce. And before you do, you can go to YouTube. There are a lot of excellent videos, like short tutorial videos, to give you a sense of how you might interact with Deduce to see if you like it before you commit. So I would recommend starting there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome.
If you know of any YouTube video off the top of your head that's really great in particular, for someone coming from a quantitative background, I'd love to just see a couple videos to get started exploring that.
Deduce. Okay. Yes, I will do. You know what? I'll send out a follow-up email to all of you, and I'll include that as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else have a burning question?
Can I ask you a question on the on grounded theory? The constant comparison or comparative? Can't read my writing here.
Okay.
The way I understood it was, as you're going through this process, you're comparing your new incoming data to what you had.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're using something like structured interviews, wouldn't that change the questions you were asking later in interviews? If
Yes.
you are, then how do you compare it to the data you've already collected with different questions?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question, because that is what makes grounded theory a little unique, is that your interview guide will evolve as you start to form, as the themes emerge, and as you start to form the theory. The interview guide will be adjusted accordingly. So yeah, you may look back at the first interview you did and the last interview, and they may look quite a bit different. So yeah, that's pretty typical of grounded theory, that you adjust your questions or your emphasis as you go along, as your theory takes shape. Mm-hmm.
And would I expect that this would also change the coding as I go?
Yeah, I mean, your code book would change. You would be adding codes. Your categories would change. Yeah, but certainly as your theory takes shape, it should become, more solid and more robust as you go along. But yes, that will change. Your codes will change. But hopefully, after the first 3 or 4 interviews, the key themes will start to solidify. So you won't have 10 interviews behind you that look nothing like the last 10. Hopefully, you've got kind of an upside down pyramid effect, where things start to get more solidified as you go along. But yeah, great questions, absolutely. And that's kind of the iterative process of grounded theories, that you're continuing to go through the motions, but things can change along the way, which is kind of the beauty of qualitative research. And I should have said in my presentation that some questions the students ask us, the answer is, it depends. There's a lot of gray area in qualitative research as well, which is why, you know, we're very transparent as researchers about our process. But definitely that evolution within the single study in grounded theory is unique, and it's what makes it pretty interesting and I think pretty compelling. Anything else? I know we're over, folks, so please, if you have, you know, if you're still on and you have to go, please feel free. Any other questions? All right, well, I really appreciate you attending, everybody, and I will send out some resources to folks. I'll try to focus on some that are particularly helpful, but if any of you want additional resources or want to chat about maybe a study you're thinking about or want to follow up on some of these concepts, I'm happy to schedule time to talk with you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Can I ask you one more thing?
Oh, sure.
It's just the old version, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's the one you're using?
Yep. We've got a couple of, let's see, ethnography and what, I can't see who's the author. Okay, yeah. And I have an entire book on ethnography because that's not, you know, an area that I've explored personally.
Okay, I didn't know if this was, different fields would use different key authors.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There are books, you know, that are focused on, you know, healthcare, you know, a lot of nursing articles that I draw upon. I've drawn upon articles, for example, that are situated within different disciplines, but still the common themes are there and helpful. The book that I talked about here, the Daly book, it's actually in family studies and human development. And so a lot of the examples he gives are within that, but still it's fantastic. I think, so yeah, but that Creswell is definitely one that we use, especially in our classes. I'm going to stop recording real quick.